So of course, what does that mean? We don't have enough workers. The working age population outlook is very poor. That brings up the very controversial issue of migration, of course. Now, the only way for the working age population to grow in North America substantially, certainly in Europe, in some of those East Asian economies, is through migration. But there is very little appetite right now in the world for increased migration. We've seen a lot of resistance to it here in the US. We see it in Europe. How this is managed going forward is going to be an important issue because we still see in the poorest parts of the world substantial population growth. If you look, I talked about the birth rate being just one child per woman in China. In places in, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of the Middle East, it's still 6 children per woman. So the working age populations in those regions are growing tremendously fast without job creation levels matching them. So are we going to see a big transformation in manufacturing and other industries to those places where the population is growing, or are we going to see an acceleration of the process of automation and technological advancement? That's a big question going forward. So finally, here we have 2 pillars now that don't look that strong. Trade and investment. We're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot because it's not growing, and a lot of that has to do with decisions made by economic and political leaders. Second pillar, demographics, also looking dangerously unstable at the moment because working age populations are set to fall dramatically. So what's the third? Where's the growth going to come from? It's got to come from productivity advancements. Now, productivity measurements are notoriously controversial. There are hundreds of different productivity measurements out there. We'll look at a couple different ones here. The one we have on that chart there is total factor productivity, so that includes capital plus labor. And there you see over the last decade, it's been negative. So all of this promised productivity growth that all these technological changes and process changes were going to bring haven't really resulted in any productivity growth. This is one of the great questions in economics right now, is why is productivity growth so disappointing? We're going to look at a couple of the theories as to why it's been so disappointing. There is no one universal answer. Nobody really agrees upon why, but we'll look at some of the more plausible theories going forward. What are some of them? Well, one, simply put, the technological and process advancements of the last couple decades just haven't really lived up to the hype. I mean, there hasn't been a dramatic advancement such as the car, for example, was 120, 110 years ago, or some other flights, some others really boosted productivity. The recent productivity, recent technological advances really haven't boosted productivity much at all. Another theory is that there are some economies or some businesses within certain industries that are seeing strong productivity growth, but they're being held back by their counterparts in their industry or other economies who are performing poorly. And there is some credence to this. If you look at some tech sectors, we've seen relatively strong productivity growth in IT, for example. But if you look at some other sectors, such as mining, for example, we've seen almost no productivity growth in recent decades. Same holds true for countries. Countries that have a more tech-based economy do have higher rates of productivity growth than those who have been left behind somewhat. Another theory is that rising levels of inequality are resulting in mass segments of the population failing to become more productive. If 50 or 60 years ago, it was easy to go straight from high school, go into a factory and have a really good job. That is very difficult these days, and that has resulted in certain segments of society losing productivity growth over time. And then finally, one issue that's not disputable is the fact that business investment simply has not been there in the 21st century. Business investment levels are extremely low. They've been extremely low for the past 20 years, and this has had a knock-on effect on productivity going forward. Those charts show these are more labor productivity, but shows productivity growth in the US and Germany. We have the charts for about 20 different countries, but the trend is clear over the longer term. Productivity growth is trending downwards. Now, in the United States, a tech-heavy economy, we saw a surge in productivity growth in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but that has dissipated significantly. In a less tech-heavy economy like Germany, which is more traditional manufacturing, we've seen consistent productivity growth declines over the past few decades. And this is replicated in emerging markets, in other developed economies. We're seeing the same trend over and over. Productivity growth over the long term declining. And this is where we need to grow if the global economy is to continue to grow going forward. So it's a dangerous combination. Trade and investment growth looks to be anemic at best in the coming years. The demographic situation is going to be very challenging for most major economies in the world, and we need to find a way to recharge productivity growth. If we fail with the last one, it's going to be very hard to generate higher levels of economic growth going forward, and that's going to be a big challenge for everybody around the world right now. So what is the state of the world economy right now? Those are nice theoretical things we've talked about, but what do we see in actual figures and actual results? Well, let's have a look. What are some of the key questions for the global economy? Can it bounce back? 2019 was a challenging year. Our prediction for economic growth in 2019 appears to have been dead on, that it would be a slowdown, it wouldn't be a hard landing. If you remember last year, our number one issue, we talked about a downturn in sync, which means that most of the world's largest economies would all grow slower in 2019 than they did in 2018. Well, that came true. 18 of the largest 20 economies in the world will have grown slower last year than they did the year before. The only two that grew faster, does anyone know? Brazil, which came out of a recession, and Japan, which grew by 0.9%, which beat 0.8% the year before. So that's it. Everybody else grew slower. That's like the Browns winning 6 games instead of 5. They went backwards. They won 7 and only won 6. So the Browns also were in the downturn in sync last year. One of the key issues, of course, is are these trade tensions that we just talked about, are they going to persist, and what impact are they going to have on the global economy going ahead? Can the U.S. continue to defy expectations of a slowdown? If you listen to a lot of economists, they've been predicting a sharp slowdown for a couple of years now, and it hasn't come to fruition. The U.S. economy, the first estimate of fourth quarter growth was in line with what we thought. Our estimate for last year's growth was 2.3%. We'll look ahead in a couple slides to see what we predict for the U.S. going forward. Europe is in a slowdown. We'll talk about that. The European numbers that came out this morning were worse than expected, in fact, so we'll talk about that. China and India had very disappointing 2019s. These are considered to be the two main growth engines for the global economy, and they both underperformed substantially last year. Political trends, clearly politics is having a bigger impact on the economy than at any time in recent memory. That's likely to continue. And then we will touch upon the controversial subject of the U.S. presidential election in November. So let's move forward. The global economy. We estimate the global economy grew by 2.9% last year. That's the lowest rate of growth since the financial crisis in 2009. Between 2012 and 2018, the economy was remarkably steady, growing between 3.4 and 3.8%. So 2.9 is a substantial decline in growth. Our forecast for 2020 is the same, 2.9%. But if you look overall, if you look at those last two charts, the global economy grew so far in the 20th century by almost 4% per year. That's a higher rate of growth than in the 1980s, than in the 1990s. Now, most of that growth came from emerging markets. And when we go forward, our prediction for the entire 2020s is growth of 3.3% per year. So we're looking at global economic growth in the next 10 years that will be significantly lower than it has been over the past 20 years. A lot of that has to do with the fact that many of the key emerging markets that were driving growth are slowing, which is natural as they become wealthier, and the fact that developed economies are still struggling to find growth. So developed economies, so the US, Canada, West Europe, some East Asian economies, Australia, there's a clear trend towards lower growth, and this has been happening for decades. You remember my discussion about if your grandparents had a firm in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and they were operating mostly in the US and Europe, the economy was growing by more than 4%. They were lucky. They didn't have to do much. The market was growing. The economy was growing. Then when that company shifted to your parents, in those markets, growth fell to 3% per year in the 1980s and 1990s in developed economies. So growth started to slow. And what's happened over the last 20 years, the developed economies around the world have grown by less than 2% per year, just 1.9% per year. So we've seen a definite trend towards lower growth. And all of those factors we talked about earlier play into that. We've seen demographic declines in most developed economies. We've seen trade and investment move to emerging markets over the last 20 years. And we've seen productivity growth decline. So it's been a very rough time for developed economies. Now, between 2015 and 2018, there was a little bit of a bounce back. We saw healthier rates of growth in a lot of developed economies, but 2019 was a challenging year.